Board games are visual narratives that offer a unique lens through which we can explore cultural representation and the implicit messages they convey. While board games from chess to pachisi have been part of ancient Indian culture, the present study looks at the representation of India in contemporary board games. Board games are an important part of popular culture in various societies despite the prevalence of video games. Because of its visuals and narratives, these games have the potential to influence perception. The current study looks at tabletop games based on India as a subject of analysis within the ambit of culture studies and game studies. In this presentation, we will first briefly discuss the theoretical framework guiding our study, followed by the methodology. Then we will share some of the key findings. The term culture has multiple meanings. For the operational definition, we turn to Hofstede, who has defined culture as, quote, the collective programming of the mind that helps distinguish members of one group or category of people with another, unquote. Lotman looked at culture from a semiotic perspective, that is, culture as being a system of signs that convey meaning. According to him, culture is a sum of text. He has a very wide definition of text, which includes also multimodal aspects. We also see researchers that highlight that games reflect culture. Thus, board games can be thought of as cultural text that convey meaning through the narratives, game design, and the themes. Now, in order to create the games, the developers draw from historical and cultural memory by incorporating historical events, characters, as well as visuals from these eras. Lotman introduced the concept of semiosphere, a space in which meaning making occurs. In the context of the game, we posit that the game's setting, narratives, and the design creates a semiotic space where cultural memory can be reinforced, constructed, and interpreted by the players. Thus, the objective of the study is to investigate the representation of India in tabletop games and the cultural meaning embedded in the game's verbal and visual aspects. Tabletop games for the study were sourced from the platform Board Game Geeks using a series of keywords. We got a list of 245 games and then went through the description and eliminated games that were published before 1900s that were based on the American indigenous group, Indiana Jones, games that were in non-English language, and games that were trivia. We included games that were expansion packs and had different revised versions, especially if the iconography or visuals of the game were different. For instance, the game Maharaja, it was initially published in 2004 and the visuals and the iconography of the game included palaces and of course Maharajas. But the later version of the game, published in 2021, included temples, Indian gods, and Maharajas. So we've used this, or we've kept this as two separate entries. We arrived at a total of 89 games. The oldest game in our corpus dates to 1910 and includes illustrative cards published by a missionary society based on the work that they had done. The latest games in our series were published this year in 2024. You have the game Vijayanagra, which is a war game between various empires in medieval India. The second game is Kursi, which means chair in Hindi. In this game on elections, various political parties, they strategize in order to gain votes. The highest rated game is Casa de India, which is set in 15th century and the Portuguese colonial conquest. We plotted the games based on the year of their release in intervals of 10 years and observed that there has been an exponential increase in tabletop games from the year 2000 onwards. From 2011 to 2020, 34 games were released. From 2021 onwards, 18 games have been recorded. However, this decade is not over yet, and based on trends, more games can be expected. After analyzing the visuals and the description of the game, we classified the game into 4 categories, depending upon the level of cultural representation. 20 games had no cultural representation. By this I mean that apart from the title, the games did not include any references or elements related to India or Indian culture. For instance, Sail to India and East India companies. The majority of games in our corpus had a low or minimum level of cultural representation. Games like Destination Delhi or Kerala, The Way of the Elephant, incorporated elements like specific landmarks, historical figures, traditional practices, but these were not deeply explored and are stereotypical. A handful of games, like the game Angry Indians, had a high level of cultural representation as they immersed players in the complexity and the richness of Indian culture. The game Vijayanagara, which I referenced some time back, had player cards on Indian mythology, and the game book included background on identical origin stories of the hare and the hound, including personal values inherited from Delhi. Observe that the number of games that have a low level of cultural representation have increased with the increase in number of games. From 2010 onwards, the number of games having higher cultural representation have increased. Description as well as visuals of the games, we see recurring aspects of Indian culture. Some of the games use Devanagari Latin infused fonts. Now, we do see a lot of cultural products. There are maps of India, the Indian flag, valuable goods like jewels, spices, tea, indigo, clothing items like the turban, saris, other products like trains, tiffins, temples and palaces. We do see a lot of characters also. Brown skin characters in traditional attire, wearing turbans, saris, shawls, Indian headwear. Characters like Maharajas, rulers, merchants, industrialists, priests and gods also are found in these games. There are also games having historical figures like Gandhi and Chandragupta Maurya. Animals like elephants, the king cobra, tigers also feature. At least a dozen places in India feature in the title of games. Iconic cities like Amritsar, Jaipur, Agra, Delhi, Darjeeling, Mumbai and states like Goa and Kerala. There are also entire games on the tea village of Alubari in the northeast, as well as the Johari Bazaar, famous for its jewels. We see very often the silhouette of the Taj Mahal. And in addition, you do have the iconography of the Qutub Minar, the Hampi Chariot and the Golden Temple. The practices often observed in these games are trading, building and waging wars. It's very interesting to also see the perspective of the insider and the outsider that permeate these games. The spatial arrangement on the board game, often maps of the world, represent geopolitical relations. At least 20 of the games were on the colonial period, and India is depicted as a land of riches and an exotic place. We observe the romanticization of colonialism, which is also reflected in prior studies. This romanticization of games on the colonial period reinforced biases in historical narratives from the global north. The recurring themes are battles or wars. We also see at least a handful of games on the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857, which essentially was a rebellion against the British rule in India. Now, war games in the corpus range from ancient India to modern warfare, including simulations of wars between India and Pakistan, underlining that Indian territory is coveted and fought over. Other recurring themes that occur in these games include trading and resource management. To conclude, this presentation highlights some of the denotative and connotative meanings embedded in the multimodal elements in tabletop games on the theme of India. Further, the study showcases the evolving nature of cultural representations in games in the last few years. Considering the limited availability of visuals and other paratextual elements of the game on the platform, there is inconclusive evidence on the influence of provenance, complexity, rating, and target age group of the players of these games on the level of cultural representation. Thus, a further deeper analysis is required to shed light on the influence of factors beyond the economics that govern cultural representation.